Hello, hello, everyone. My name is Kristen, aka Like Water, and I am so excited to be here to welcome you to today's in session Mixing 101 with Kate Ellwanger, aka Dot. So, Kate is going to take us through the basics of mixing a song from start to finish using Ableton Live. All right. If you don't have Ableton, don't worry. Right after this webinar, please head over to ableton.com to take advantage of a free 90-day trial and a special thank you from our friends over at Ableton for attending today's in session. They are offering 25% discount off Ableton Live Suite or Standard by using code SOFAR25. That is SOFAR 25, the number 25. And the offer expires Friday, September 3rd. So make sure you head over there and grab that so that you can utilize these skills that Kate is going to share with us. So these skills will also be transferable to other DAWs as well. So if you aren't already excited, Kate Ellwanger is an incredible producer, vocalist, and multi-instrumentalist whose blend of electronic, indie rock, and R&B elements has awarded her a role as one of the most respected emerging producers. She's incredible. She's part of LA Beat Collective Team Supreme and the founder of the woman-focused music label Unspeakable Records. Her music has been praised by Nylon, Pitchfork, Red Bull, and Ableton, just to name a few. She's produced for artists including SZA and Terry Genderbender and writes music for film and commercials with clients including Nike, MTV, and OWN, just to name a few. So she was also a panelist at Loop Berlin, which is Ableton's Summit for Music Makers. She's also taught music production and composition at critically acclaimed institutions, including the Los Angeles Recording School, Dubspot, Point Blank, and Garnish. So if you all weren't already excited about this incredible webinar, I'm sure you are now. Please join me in welcoming Kate Ellwanger.
Hey,
Hey,
what's up,
Kate.
everyone? So weird to hear my bio read back sometimes. I'm like, oh, I guess I have done a little bit of work in the past decade.
Yes, your bio is incredible. Like I can't wait to like just start like taking notes as you go through all of this. Like you're incredible. Thank you for being with us, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so looking forward to mixing some music with you all. Like you mentioned, this is going to be sort of an intro to mixing. I'm going to do my best to keep things pretty basic and foundational. So for those of you tuning in who are maybe brand new to this process, I want to make sure that this is geared especially for you. But all of that said, I do want to sneak in a few little other more advanced quote unquote tips and tricks that I like to use. So we'll see how far we get on. But really looking forward
Awesome.
to this.
That sounds incredible. All right. So before I let you take it away, just a
Okay.
few housekeeping items. So we're going to dive in. Kate is going to take us through all these incredible mixing techniques for the first 45 minutes. Then I'm going to jump back on for the open Q&A at the end. So this is a supportive and uplifting space. So just make sure that you keep that in mind as we get into the chat. Also, feel free, like you guys already have, jump in that chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Show your support or connection to the topics that Kate will be discussing. But if you have any questions, before that, make sure to change the little blue button at the bottom of your Zoom screen from panelists to panelists and attendees, so we can all see where you guys are tuning in from, see what you're dropping in the chat. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Be sure to drop your questions in there so that it doesn't get lost in the slew of chat messages, and we can hopefully get to it at the end. So without further ado, Kate, I'm going to let you take it away and take us on this incredible mixing journey, and I will be back whenever you're ready for me. Cool?
Sounds good. Awesome. Let's get
Awesome. Thanks,
into
Kate.
it. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here in a second. I have a demo session pulled up for us to work on. It is a sketch kind of in progress, a little bit shorter and with fewer tracks than maybe a more finished session. So I'm doing my best to keep things simple and basic for today. So I will go ahead and share that in a second. Let's see. Zoom is giving me a message that says you cannot start share screen while the other participant is sharing. So I don't know if someone on tech wants to help me out with that. There we go. All right, we'll share the sound. Do, do, do. Great. So here is our session. Also just wanted to note this headset is not my usual go-to for mixing per se. I have another headset that I like to use for things like this that is on the fritz right now. So we've got the cat ears for today, keeping it festive. All right, so very basic session. We've got some drums, we've got a few little sound effects, we've got bass sound, some chords, lead synth, and some vocals. So nothing too crazy going on here. The first thing that I wanted to bring up with you all is just your session prep. So anytime I go into mixing down a track, I want to make sure that I am not using the same session that I used to produce the music in. Okay, I don't want necessarily like a bunch of MIDI tracks everywhere and automation lanes. The process will go much more smoothly if you bounce everything down to stems, to audio tracks. So you can either, save a new version of the session and freeze and flatten all of your tracks so that way anything that's MIDI will automatically convert or be printed to audio, or you can bounce out all of the stems and bring it into a fresh session, whatever makes more sense. But just making sure that you are prepared in that way, and also making sure that everything is labeled and organized. Again, for whatever system makes sense for your brain, I usually go lowest to highest, but starting with drums. So have like the low end of my drums, the kick up here at the top, and then we'll head on down to things that hang out more in the upper ranges of the frequency spectrum, and then I'll get into, I kind of categorize some of these sound effects as like percussive. So I put them over here next to the drums, but then we've got our bass, right, our foundation, and then on up into some chords, which is more in the mid-range, lead, and then vocals on top. And if you want to be extra organized too, like I do right now, I'm going to group my whole instrumental together and just label that instrumental. So that way I can quickly, mute or engage just the instrumental, or, solo just the vocals very quickly. So, that being said, we are all set. Got everything in its right place. I want to play a little snippet of this just so you can hear what we're going to be working with today to give ourselves some context. And another reason why I chose this session, not only for its simplicity, but there's a few specific problems going on in this that I want to address. And so maybe you'll hear it on this first pass, but I'll talk about it in a second. We'll just play a little bit of this and see what's happening. So that is what we're going to be working with today. I don't know if anyone guessed the problem, at least as far as my perspective goes, but I like the vibe of this track. I really like the instrumental. I have some sort of resampled vocals in here that were originally from another track that I threw in this one for us to work with. But what I'm hearing now is sort of like instrumental soup. There's a lot of frequencies stacking up sort of in the low mids. That's making everything sound like it's nice. It's got this watery, flowy, cool vibe to it, but at the cost of overall clarity in the mix. And we're definitely losing a lot of the vocals. I like a lot of the spatial effects that are happening. Like, I'm a sucker for just, using way too much reverb and delay. It's so fun. But that can mean that we're sacrificing clarity and making the energy actually kind of drop down a little bit. So your mix can greatly affect sort of the energy and momentum of the track. It's not just the composition and production that affects that. So we want to address that. I want to keep that sort of dreamy, watery vibe, but I also want a little bit more clarity in our mix. I don't want it to drag the whole session down. So we will just start from the very beginning. You will hear, I'm sure, as you go along your musical journeys, so many different approaches and methodologies to mixing, to recording engineering, to mastering. All that to say, this is my sort of way of doing things that I've learned from various mentors and teachers and resources over the years, but this is by no means like the end-all be-all way of how you should approach things. So just wanted to mention that as well in case, I say something that conflicts with what you heard from another source. There's all sorts of different ways of approaching this. So just wanted to mention that. But the way that I like to structure my sessions is I have sort of an order of operations that I follow. So I don't know if you can think back to, sixth grade math or something. But when you're working out an equation or trying to solve a problem, there's sort of an order of operations that you follow in order to arrive at the answer. So I like to follow this not only because it relieves a lot of the mental strain that I sometimes feel when I'm working on, maybe mixes that are far more complex than this one. It's nice to kind of have that structure to fall back into and not feel so much mental fatigue and keep things fresh throughout the session. But the other reason why I like to just kind of have this format or formula is it's repeatable, and especially when you are learning how to mix for the first time, I recommend that people actually try mixing the same session a couple times through and see how your results differ from one pass to another. So you can even, when you're getting started, save a session in its original sort of format. Like I would save a version of this so that way I could come back to the beginning after doing a full pass, follow that same order of operations again, maybe make some changes here and there based on my experience during the first pass, and then see how those results differ. You will learn so much more from that process, that experience, that hands-on experience, than I think, any YouTube tutorial or something could teach you, or anything that I could teach you, right? And as we go to, you'll see there's sort of a reason for the order in which things are done. When you're building a house, you wouldn't necessarily start working on the roof before the foundation is in place, right? So I want to get some of our foundational pillars sort of in place for us to build off of, before worrying about, too many other like little fine-tuned details that we don't need to be incorporating too early on in the process. All right, I'm going to try to talk a little bit less, mix a little bit more. So first order of operations is straight up just our volume and our panning. So I like to go through, I'm going to tab over to just our session, or sorry, session view here. And we're going to go through and grab all of these faders and just turn everything down. Let me just try to move this zoom window so it's not in my way. There we go. So gonna grab everything in our drum kit, zero it out. Gonna grab these, zero them out. Everyone be quiet. Grab these other tracks, zero them out. Lead, zero that out. And I'm also gonna just I'm saying zero out, but they're actually going to silence, negative infinity. I'm also going to just zero out these groups. So yeah, sorry for the confusion in terminology there. When I say zero out, I actually mean setting these faders to zero on all of my groups, but for the individual tracks, I want them all to be silenced at nothing. Okay. Hope that was a little bit more clear. It's hard to talk and mix at the same time. So we're going to start by just bringing up these tracks volume-wise one at a time. Again, I'm roughly going from lowest to highest. I want to get my foundation in place first. I have seen other engineers who, rather than maybe starting with the instrumental, they mix the vocals first and then mix the instrumental sort of into the vocals. So depending on the genre or the style of music that you're working in, that process might even make a little bit more sense, depending on if the vocals are maybe a more foundational element of the song. In this case, it's definitely very beat driven, so that is what I am starting with and mixing into. So yeah, let's just bring up our kick. I'm going to go to a section of the arrangement that has a little bit of everything in it, and we'll just get it looping, so that way I don't have to go back and forth. And I'm going to be pretty conservative as far as volume goes here starting out, because I know that we have a lot of tracks to incorporate, and I want to make sure that we are leaving plenty of headroom, meaning, space in the mix before it starts clipping, so that we keep things nice and healthy level-wise. And on this track, I think I'm using like 3 different kicks, which I normally don't recommend, but we're just being rebels over here, breaking rules. So we'll get these up. This is sort of more of a click. Bring this down. Cool. Put this one up. And as I go, I'm also just thinking about not only the individual sounds as I bring up each one in volume, but also I'm imagining the rest of the track and where all of those sounds are going to sit. This is something that's going to come back into play when we talk about EQ, especially. Anytime you're focusing in on an individual sound, you don't want to just think about it out of context with the track. You want to make sure that you are considering everything else that's going to be sitting around it, and always kind of have that bigger picture view in mind as you go. So again, there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason, I guess, to where exactly I'm setting these specific levels at this point. I'm doing my best to just use my ears, go off of what I think sounds nice. I generally try to keep the level of like the kick and the snare, or in this case, kicks plural and snares plural, relatively like evenly balanced against one another. Your kick and snare, at least in this style of music, is really like the backbone of everything. And if one of them is like significantly louder than the other, it you might sort of feel a little lopsided or feel a little bit off balance. So I'm trying to keep that perceived loudness as even as possible. When I say perceived loudness, I don't know how many of you are familiar with like the Fletcher, I believe it's Fletcher-Munson curves. Let's actually get a quick visual on that. Fletcher-Munson curve. There we go. So the human ear has, there we go. Our ears have different levels of sensitivities to different frequencies, right? It's not just straight across the board. So you'll notice we have the greatest amount of sensitivity actually sort of around the range of a human vocal because from like an evolutionary standpoint or like look on this on this subject, we evolved to, you know, be this social species, and a lot of our survival was dependent on communication with other people. So it makes sense that our ears are particularly sensitive in these ranges. Musically speaking, this means that, you know, for your kicks and your bass lines and things like that, our ears are going to be a little bit less sensitive to them. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind here as we go along. I could launch into a whole other discussion on this, but I am doing my best to keep things moving. Google that later if you're interested. So all that to say, perceived loudness, you know, what I might see visually represented versus what I'm hearing back in the headphones might be a little bit different, because the perceived loudness of like a snare that has a lot of highs, you know, that might sound more upfront in the mix than it looks right now, because we have a little more juice on these kicks coming through. We can see like in the metering here. So hope that kind of makes sense. All right. I'm happy with this balance. We can always go back in and you know, fine tune it more later, but we'll keep it moving. Let's get more of these tops in place. Just some little textures. And this other break, I think, comes in a bit later. So let's move over in the arrangement. Oops, didn't like that. All right, I'm happy with that so far. Let's bring in some of these sound effects. Bring in this last one. All right, I am digging that so far. Usually when I'm going through this process of bringing sounds in one at a time, I also want to think about where things are sitting in the stereo field. not just volume-wise. And so this actually reminds me, I wanted to also reference this other set of lovely Google images. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this classic work, The Art of Mixing, but it's a great resource to have. I forget when this was originally published. It's definitely been out for a while. So, you know, some of it might be a little bit dated, but at the end of the day, you know, frequency and sound hasn't necessarily changed over the years, and a lot of these principles still hold true in modern music. And I just really like a lot of these graphs, these visuals, for imagining where your sounds are sitting sort of in a three-dimensional space. So we have left to right, which is our panning, right, where things are sitting in the stereo field. We have front to back, which is, you could also equate to like volume. So if something is very loud, we might perceive it as being closer to us versus quiet. It might be farther away. And then we have top to bottom, which is frequency, right? So high to low, high sounds, low sounds. That's sort of what this, this graph is representing. Again, we could get into a much larger conversation on this, but for now, definitely check this out. I believe it's also a video series as well, if I remember correctly, so very good resource. All that to say, I want to move some of these sound effects a little bit off center. Just to kind of open things up a bit. Likewise with some of these textures, I might just move them very slightly, just to leave a little bit more room in the middle for other things to come later on. For kicks, those are normally going to stay pretty much dead center. We could get a little more creative with some of these extra kicks that we're using if we wanted to move those around, but I don't want to have too much happening with perceived like motion going left to right in some of these foundational elements, because I don't want the listener to get like dizzy. I know it can sound cool to play with a lot of stereo like motion and movement, but that's something that you just definitely don't want to overdo. When it is overdone, it kind of can get a little distracting and take away from like just the message of the music. So we will keep that at a minimum for now. I see there's stuff in the chat too, so I don't mean to ignore any of these questions, but we will hopefully get to as many of them as possible at the end. Great, so now let's bring up our bass. And I'm just going to mix it a little bit quieter than I think it needs to be. My cardinal sin, I think, is always just mixing my bass way too loud. I know a lot of people also have maybe this challenge, because I love bass. It's like my favorite part of the track, and I'm like, I want to make sure everyone can hear it. But you also have to think about each instrument's function as you're going along. Like, is the bass line in this context really supposed to be the focus point of the track? And it's not. It's playing more of a supporting role. So we want to make sure that it's not sort of going against its function mix-wise. So just make sure that it's kind of hanging out down there, doing its thing. Let's bring up some of these chords. Synth line. right. Cool. So we have things sort of roughly in place volume-wise. Now the real work begins. So once we get things dialed in regarding volume and panning, the next order of operations that I move into is EQ. And if you're taking notes, I guess I can sort of give you all of these. So I like to go track by track, EQ everything. Following EQ, I guess the third sort of main category or step that I go into is compression. After compression, I might get into any manner of like tonal effects or chorus, phasers, flangers, things that are maybe a little bit more creative, tape emulators, stuff that's like affecting the tone or like the overall character of the sound. And in some cases that actually was already addressed during sound design or production. And in some cases that actually will happen sort of before EQ if I want to saturate something and then EQ it afterwards. So there's all sorts of exceptions to that rule, but that's generally when I would address, like if a sound is all EQ'd and compressed and nice, but it's still sounding like a little bit too clean, maybe I want to dirty it up a little bit, I might throw on some sort of tape emulator, or I really love Ableton's Redux. We'll talk about that in a second. There's all sorts of different ways you can kind of mess up a sound if it's sounding too clean, give it some character. And after that, in some cases, I would even follow that with another EQ, so something else that we'll touch on in a second. But once all that's done, the last sort of step that I address is spatial effects, so reverb and delay. And then we'll talk about processing groups and maybe even a little bit of mastering if we can get into it. But let's get into some EQ. So first of all, just wanted to, let's see, we'll solo our drum kit here first. EQ, if you are not already familiar, I'm going to grab Ableton's EQ8. And we'll bring this up so we have a larger view of the graph. This is just a sweet little map of frequency. It's loudness, so volume here is on this axis, and then we have frequency from low to high. So anytime we are changing the EQ or making, cuts, boosts, anything like that, we are altering the balance between a sound's fundamental frequency and any harmonics or overtones. And when we do that, we are in essence changing sort of the tone of the sound, the timbre of the sound. So, the balance of or the makeup of a sound's like harmonics or overtones over its fundamental frequency is basically what differentiates my voice singing A3 versus me playing A3 on a synth versus me playing A3 on a piano versus someone playing it on a saxophone. Like it's all the same note, same, maybe fundamental frequency, but it's those overtones that are changing or determining the character of the sound. So again, could keep going on and on about this, but just wanted to give sort of a basic explanation of what we're even doing with EQ. And so beginning with this kick drum, I want to basically go through every sound in this session, and I'm going to focus on subtraction. So I want to take away frequencies that are not really supporting the function of this sound within the greater context of the session. So if you do this properly, if you take away everything that is not needed, By contrast, what is needed or what is wanted will come through the mix more clearly, and you won't necessarily, hopefully, have to make a bunch of boosts and other changes because you've done all of your cleanup work and you're good. So subtractive EQ is what we're going to be focusing on mostly for now. So I'm going to cut on this first kick, just cut some of these lows. Let's actually get this soloed so we can really hear what's happening. And this is already mixed and compressed really well. I think this is one of the decap samples, yeah. But I'm just thinking for this track, it would be nice to have maybe even a tighter, sort of less, not that it's flubby, but just a tighter sounding kick. And so my quick trick for this is to, we'll grab our second band here. I'm going to increase our Q value so that way this curve is narrower. And I'm going to turn on this headphone icon right here. So that way when I'm clicking and moving something, we just hear that range soloed. And when I let go, you'll hear the full sound. But I'm going to go over to sort of the flubby zone or the muddy zone. Right around here. I don't want to take away from here because I like that nice low, that nice pillowy, subby low end. And I don't want to go up here and lose any of that punch or power. But right in here, it's kind of no man's land. I feel like we could take a little bit of that out. So here's without and with. Super subtle, but when you make small changes like this to every single sound in the session, it really adds up over time. So I'm happy with that. Let's see what else we could do here. Some of these other, actually let's get this full kit soloed. Let's check out, we have two snare layers here. So I'm going to solo both of them simultaneously. And we're going to use some EQ to clean this up a little bit. So for this snare, can you hear how one of them has maybe a little bit more body to it, more tone, like in the mids? And this one is really just sitting up nice and it has that nice, airy, crispy quality to it that I like. So, because I don't want these two sounds to conflict with one another too much, I want to use them as sort of layers of the same function. I'm going to remove a lot of the lows of one and some more of the highs of the other. So let's start with this one. Just going to dampen it a little bit, and I'm also going to go through here. We don't need anything down there. So on its own, doesn't sound as glorious as the original, but when we add this one, clean up all of that, we don't need anything down there, so we're just cutting it. Now when they're together, it's a little more focused, a little less sort of conflict there. So let's get this kit soloed again. Great. And I would keep doing this sort of very detailed throughout every single track, every single little sound in the session, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna just keep things moving really quickly, clean up roughly sort of what we don't want with some of these sounds. So because again, this part of the drum kit is functioning as like a top or a texture, I want to cut a lot of these lows to address that problem that we had, that we talked about in the beginning, of there just being too much soup happening in the mix overall, too much going on in like the low mids. So I'm going through and cutting out a lot of what we don't need. See this break, I like some of those lows, so I want to leave a bit of that intact. But I want to make sure I'm leaving space for other sounds that are, you know, occupying this zone. A lot of our main snare is kind of sitting right there, so I don't want those two sounds to collide too much, making space for them to sit. So already that's sounding a lot less cluttered, I think, than the first version of of those drums. Great. Let's move on to our bass. Bring that in as well. And on this sound, I've already got, let's see, we have some saturation. I'll just go piece by piece here. Got a little saturation. So here's without. And this is just Ableton's like stock saturator. I think I started off with the a bit warmer preset, which is a great one. Then we've got some redux that I followed it with just a little bit. I mean, we have our dry wet down to like, it was 23%, I think. So here's what that sounds like at full 100%. Bring that down just a bit. I just like that kind of vintage, almost arcade sound. That's not quite it, but you catch my drift. And let's bring in some EQ. So I am just cutting out this sort of like these ghost lows. I don't want to go up above our fundamental frequencies, because if I do, we lose all of our power. So I want to make sure we're not going above those fundamentals. And again, from here, if I wanted to, I could listen for a bit of mud to potentially scoop out. But all of this is sounding pretty good, pretty wanted from my perspective. I know there's going to be a lot of sounds that are sitting in this range, so I'm kind of scooping out more than I normally would here, just to make even more space for like that lead synth and those vocal samples, and just letting the bass really do its function, which is holding down the lows. And we're getting sort of a lot of like airiness or fuzziness sort of from that Redux, the vintage sampler preset here that I showed you. So I want to ease up a little bit on that, just so that it's not conflicting with like those nice more like percussive tops and textures in the drums as well. So we've got that. Let's put it back in context with our drums. And then I also followed this with Gatekeeper. This is something that might come up more in like the production or sound design phase. And I was going to try to use less plugins today, but I love this plugin for not only like creating more motion or rhythmic interest in any sound. Like I use this on a lot of pads. a more percussive feel, where otherwise they might kind of like drag down the overall vibe of the song. But the other reason why I like this is because it just helps you to automatically like clear out more space from the arrangement slash mix. I think one of the biggest challenges that especially newer producers have address or manage is making sure that you're leaving lots of open space in your compositions, open space in your arrangements, and also open space in the mix. So we don't want every single moment of the song to have like a musical event, to have a note, to have something happening. It's okay to have spots of a little bit more silence, right? You know, if I were like a middle school art teacher, I could tell you, like, consider the negative space in your pieces, because that's just as much a part of the form, you know, as the notes and rhythms and things themselves. So, and I said this is a challenge that newer producers face, but I actually just mean all producers. I take that back. It's something that you always have to consider, and it's so easy, especially with Ableton or any digital workstation. It's so easy to just keep adding and adding and adding tracks, elements, different things to your productions, because it's essentially free to do so. Like, you have this near infinite capability to continue to add, whereas, like, you know, if you're making a track, if back in the 70s or something and recording everything to tape, there are significant limitations to that. Not only in time, but in cost, all sorts of things. So because it's so easy to add tons and tons of things, that's something that we have to consciously compensate for and make sure that we're continuing to carve out space, not just in the mixing phase, but in our productions and arrangements. So have this Gatekeeper on. Here's without. Nice, but with it on, we have a little bit more sort of bounce. I like how it relates to the drums with this on. We're getting a bit of a volume decrease, so I'm going to just kind of make up for that a little bit here on the gain. And now let's check out these chords. Just tab back over here. I feel like they were in a lower register at this part of the arrangement. Yep. So here's where it gets real soupy. Cut a lot of this out. Even though it's so lovely and beautiful on its own, we have to think about it in context with the rest of this track. So that's sounding, I think, a little bit better. Might even tuck this into the background a little bit more. Check out this lead. There's a lot going on here already that I have on the track. So let's go through one by one, and I will just quickly explain why I made these choices. Here's without our naked lead. Pretty nice. I threw on some OTT, which I love. Ableton also has one of these built in if you go into your audio effects and check out dynamics, multi-band dynamics. You have an OTT preset right here as well if you don't want to use this plugin. But I have just a little bit of this to give it that OTT sound. No. To increase that sort of sense of presence, but without necessarily adding like saturation. And again, we're just cutting all the lows of this sound I might even cut some of these highs too, because I don't want it to conflict with this vocal sample that we're also working with. So we've also got even more saturation happening, just to really kind of like warm up the sound, mess it up a little bit. Like it sounds kind of at this point too clean to me, which is why I think I then added this. We could even put that before the EQ. And then a little compression. We have it sidechained to our kit, but because we turned the volumes down so much, it's not quite picking up on, there we go. So for those of you who have never encountered sidechain compression yet in your sort of mixing experience, this is something that we could talk a lot more about. It's an effect that definitely I think gets overused. It's easy to overdo it, but every now and then it comes in handy. All we're doing is telling this sound to decrease in volume every time we get a signal from, in this case, it's our drum kit. So we're getting a bit of a ducking effect anytime, especially those kicks and snares hit. If I were to do this in a very extreme way, you can hear this sort of exaggerated. But this is, again, not only a nice way to sort of clear up more space, maintain that sort of presence of the lead without it conflicting too much with other elements of the track, but it also helps to relate this sound more closely, like musically, with the rhythm. It's not just sort of floating on top, doing its own thing. Now it all of a sudden has this stronger sense of motion and relationship to these drums because of that movement. So I'm just looking at the time now and like feeling very sad because I want to keep on going on some of these topics, but I know we have to make some time for Q&A. So I'll just quickly leave you with a few more little concepts to consider. One of them just being what I was speaking on a second ago, always thinking about how you can create closer relationships between each of the sounds in your mix. The way that we are able to make music using Ableton, using digital audio workstations is so wonderful and magical because we are so free of so many limitations. But because of that, I think it's really important that we give more attention or more consciousness, again, to how things are relating. If you were in a room of, if you were in a band and playing with a group of musicians and each one of these sounds was maybe represented by a person, how you play together, how you sort of converse musically and like can pass focus around, is obviously very important with like the success, quote unquote, of a band or how good people sound together. Because there's that relationship, there's that conversation, there's maybe a call and response, there's a reaction to what someone else is saying. And when you're throwing tracks into a session or when you're mixing down a session, if you're not actively thinking about these relationships and how these sounds play off of one another, then it's easy to get something that sounds maybe a little bit either too busy or just kind of falls flat or there's no focus or this crops up as a number of different problems. So the biggest point that I wanted to leave everyone with today, besides other things to Google later on, is just always think about what the function of each sound is in your track and how it can best support everything else that's happening, how it relates to every other sound in the track, and where can you have certain things ease up so that you're creating space, creating room for the elements that it's surrounded by. Hope that makes sense. Didn't quite get to vocals, but if there's any questions that come up maybe here in the Q&A that pertain to that, we can get into that a bit too. I don't know if Kristen wants to hop back on. What's up?
I am back, Kate. That was incredible. Like,
Oh,
oh my goodness.
I could
This, I
keep
mean, I
going
could
for
sit and
hours.
like and we could sit for hours, like taking notes. It was absolutely amazing just to watch you work and to hear your process. And thank you for sharing all
Oh,
those
thank you for
incredible
having
gems.
me. Yeah, super
Of
fun.
course. So we have a few questions. We're going to try to just do like a lightning round to see how many we can get to before.
Cool.
Thank you so much for gifting additional time now, and also for folks that are able to stay on. Um, so we have a question. How can you mix each sound in the drum kit separately when it is in a drum rack?
Oh, yeah, that's an easy answer. So this little arrow right here, this little triangle, will allow you to expand your drum rack so that you can see each individual cell or sound on its own track here. Another way to do this would be if you wanted to just eliminate the drum rack altogether and have like a group of drums and have everything stemmed out as audio, you can right click on the top of any of these and say extract chains, and that will bump it over to its very own MIDI track, I should say, with the sound contained in simpler. So that's how you would set that up. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. On to the next. That was incredible. How can I navigate in my session view, moving left and right 8 tracks per click in my MIDI controller?
I think that's going to depend on your MIDI controller. I know different makers have this set up differently, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that right now.
No
Sorry.
worries. No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
How do you define which frequencies you have to clean up to get a better sound in the end?
I mean, that's something that's very something that I sort of take on a case by case basis. As a general rule of thumb, I know you saw me like just high passing almost everything. So high pass means you're letting the highs pass through, so you are in a sense cutting the lows. So I'm rolling off the lows of like practically every sound, with the exception being our kick drum and our bass. Those are like the two that get to kind of sit down there, but everything else, if we have a lot of, or even if it's just a little bit of activity or like frequencies happening down there that aren't necessarily serving the function of that sound. If you have that across, 5 or 6 or 10 tracks, individually you might not hear that as being very loud, but when it all comes together, it's going to give you this overall sense of like the mix sounding muddy or muffled or this like perceived lack of clarity. So if you can roll off what you don't need, not to the point where you're like losing too much of the character or body or richness of the sound, but just doing that basic cleanup will really help to make everything sound better in the end, even though if you're only listening to that one sound on its own, you might not hear that significant of a difference. Yeah.
Awesome.
So,
No, that makes total sense. We're gonna try to get one
always,
last question in
yeah.
if you're able.
Yeah.
Um, what is a good way to make the vocals stand out in a mix without sounding separate from the track?
That is a good question. Two things. So, one, when you are mixing the instrumental itself, I think it's really helpful to have the vocals in mind as you go along and make sure that you are consciously leaving space for them to sit. So, like, for example, with any instruments that you have playing chords or have playing like an additional lead line, you want to make sure that they're still taking enough of a back seat to where your vocals can then sit and feel like more incorporated in the instrumental rather than separate from. And I think also too, just in the production process, anything you can do to have elements in the instrumental that are responding or reacting to the vocal. That sounds pretty vague, but if you have like a vocal line that's saying something, and then on the second half of the phrase, maybe there's like a lead synth that echoes a particular motif or fraction of the melody, that can help to create a stronger sense of like relationship and inclusion there. And then, but yeah, to still make them stand out, I really think it's just about making sure that you're leaving space in the instrumental for the vocals, and giving them priority in terms of where they are sitting in their frequency range. There's another graph that I've used in the past that's helpful when making some of these decisions. If you're not already used to looking for specific frequency ranges for vocals and instruments, etc., I think it is instruments graph frequency range EQ. Let's see if this pulls up the image I'm thinking of. It should. There we go. The interactive frequency chart. This is a nice visual to show you not only where different instruments sit. Let's see if we can just fully pull this up. Sit as far as frequency goes, but also their correlating notes on the keyboard. You have this nice Fletcher-Munson curve off to the side, so you can keep that in mind for ear sensitivity. So this could be a helpful tool for that as well. Yeah, hope that kind of
Awesome.
answers the question. It's a big
Yeah,
question, so I don't know how I
absolutely.
can fit it in a couple minutes.
No,
But
that was
yeah,
perfect.
right. Just
That was
Google it.
awesome. No, this is awesome. Thank you so, so, so much, Kate,
Thank you
a.k.a.
so
Dot,
much for
for
having me.
this incredible wealth of information and webinar today. Yeah, you're wonderful. We couldn't have asked for more,
Oh,
honestly. Shout out again to Mari and the team over at Ableton. Don't forget to head over to ableton.com and get that 25% off Ableton Live 11 Suite or Standard using code SOFAR25 at checkout. The offer expires again on Friday, September 3rd. Also, they have dropped in the chat how to connect with Dot, so be sure to head over to her Instagram to stay connected and see all of the amazing things that she has going on. And the next in session is September 16th, all about teaching artists and how to make an impact and generate income. So I am Kristen, aka Like Water. Dot, thank you so, so much again. It has
thank
been our
you.
pleasure.
So
Until
nice to
next time.
connect with you all. All right, take care.